Hey everybody, KC here. And yes, I know you're expecting Sansolo Speaks, but Michael was going to be traveling this week and was not going to be able to do his usual column. But we did want to have a conversation about a book that he read that, while not about retailing, offered a lot of business lessons for retailing. So we thought we'd do as I said in the headline, Sansolo Speaks and KC listens. So Michael, tell us about the book.
All right, thank you, Kevin. And it is good to have Kevin listening for once. The book is called The Times. It is about the New York Times. And I want to read you the overline, which is how the newspaper of record survives scandal, scorn, and the transformation of journalism. And Kevin, the reason I thought it had a great parallel to our readership here at Morning Newsbeat is that transformation of journalism. The New York Times is obviously a very healthy newspaper, but over the last 30, 40 years, it, like all other forms of media, has had to make a major transition. The New York Times, you used to only get it in print. Now, a large portion of their readership gets it digitally. And in this book, the author goes through how they made this transition. And I think every retailer certainly watching this today knows the pains of becoming an omnichannel operator, of how to have a brick and mortar store and tie in internet to that. And the Times, you go through it. As I read it, I thought, oh my God, I have heard this story from supermarket operators. How do you have a different group of people? The New York Times is a staid, old, very established, very well-run newspaper.
What they call it, the old gray
old gray lady.
Old gray lady.
And suddenly it had this internet division where everything was about speed. The people who work there had to report and write differently than the folks who worked for the New York Times paper.
So a little context, and let's first, and let's then drill down on that. So a couple of things. Full disclosure: Michael and I both started out in newspapers. We both started out working for Gannett at the same time, although for newspapers that were about 10 or 15 miles apart, and we didn't know each other. It also ends up that the author of the book that Michael's talking about is a guy named Adam Nagourney, who worked with you at the Reporter Dispatch, right? You had desks like right next to each other.
He was right behind me, actually.
Okay. So you know Adam. I've never met Adam, but you know Adam, and we both come out of the newspaper business, and I think are sort of glad we probably got out of it when we did. Let's go back to the Times for a second, because the transition was not an easy one. In fact, there were a lot of hits and misses and fits and starts because they didn't do it right in the beginning.
And he talks about that in the book. They had numerous experiments that were complete failures. They couldn't figure out how to monetize what they were doing online. And so they had pressure. They were losing advertisers. They were losing readers. And they had pressure. How do we migrate people to a digital form and make money off that? Now, by the way, not to give away the ending, the Times has succeeded. It is widely considered that what it has done digitally is the gold standard. For people out there who don't see the New York Times website, it's fabulous each and every day. And it's worth a subscription because it is interesting to read. It is fun to read. And Kevin, as you said, the old gray lady, it's much more dynamic online than it used to be in paper.
Yeah. And again, for people who may not realize this, the pot of gold for most newspapers for almost forever was always classified ads, right? That was just classified ads where they made a ton of money. And I mean, I can't tell you how many jobs I got through classified ads during my somewhat checkered and sordid career. But when things went digital, classified ads went away. I mean, it
became Craigslist.
Right, exactly. And so that funding source went away. So monetizing it was not just a matter of making more money. It was a matter of survival.
I mean, think about the audience we're talking to today. Newspapers used to run a lot of supermarket ads. That is no longer, that was a pot of gold. It's gone.
Right.
Among the things that happen in here, and that's why I think the parallel to retailers is so strong. One of the things the Times did was when they started the digital division, once they made all their mistakes, they actually put them in a separate building because they knew if those folks were near the people who wrote for the New York Times, the traditional writers were going to eat the other folks alive because they were younger people, they were less experienced people. So they saw a need to have separate offices and separate leadership, because otherwise all the people who made their bones through print, they didn't understand digital. And it took
And saw it as a, not only didn't understand it, but largely saw it as a threat.
They saw it as a threat, and they thought it was trivial compared to what they were doing. And it took, and in the book he goes through, and honestly I can't remember which incident it is. It might have even been the 9/11 attacks, where they saw the incredible power of the digital form. Like he talks about in the book, the New York Times at its peak had about 1 million copies a day in circulation. And when there were these big events, be it 9/11, elections, online, they were getting 15 and 16 million hits. And they suddenly realized that online, they were a much bigger entity than they were in paper, because suddenly people in all parts of the country, all parts of the world could be New York Times readers. And again, I'm sure we have people watching this video who don't like the New York Times because of its politics, but the New York Times is widely accepted in journalism as the gold standard, as the best newspaper out there. And their online presence has enabled them to expand that.
Sure. And important to point out that Washington Post, which has, I think has a very good website, owned by Jeff Bezos, laying people off, not making any money. Los Angeles Times just announced that they have laid off 20% of their newsroom, or they're laying off 20% of their newsroom. USA Today, you know, clearly is you know, just a shadow of it, what it used to be. Look, I mean, there's what's gone on with Sports Illustrated, which is a different kind of journalism. I mean, it hardly exists anymore. It's almost irrelevant. You know, you and I joked when, you know, Time Magazine named Taylor Swift the person of the year. The Swifties probably had two reactions. First of all, how great is it that Taylor Swift, T-Swift got named that, but what is Time Magazine?
Yeah.
Because for them, it's an irrelevant and construct. So, but it's interesting to me that how the Times has done this. I mean, I'm a Wordle devotee. I think you are as well, right?
Too, yes.
I mean, there's a thing that they bought for not a lot of money, and something like almost 1 million people every week are playing Wordle on the Times. Then they created their own another game called Connections, which Mrs. Content Guy and I are
they're addictive,
totally addictive. Sometimes I want to throw my laptop out the window. And they have I don't want to do big crossword puzzles. The mini crossword puzzle is fabulous, and you can see how the Washington Post. I play keyword on the Washington Post because
I do too.
There are ways of getting the brain kind of engaged, right?
And Kevin, and again, you and I are much more tuned to this than most because we grew up with the New York Times. The New York Times was in many respects boring. It was gray, had no color, had no comics. So when you were a little kid, you didn't like to look at the Times. And the only puzzle was the impossible New York Times crossword puzzle. Right. Now it has all these different games, and there's like 6 or 7 of them. I've also noticed on the website
it's about accessibility. It's about accessibility.
It is, and it's much more approachable. A reporter will do a story, and sometimes there's a video, and the reporter talks about the story. So what the Times did, and again, Adam does a great job in this book of taking us through this. They became a different New York Times and actually have become more successful. Now, by the way, I'm a bit of a junkie on this stuff. I'm also reading a book about the Washington Post and the attitude that Jeff Bezos brought when he bought the Post. And he didn't want to turn the Post into Amazon, but he was able to show folks at the Washington Post, again, a fairly successful newspaper, but they were losing touch with the Times. And their website is now, you know, you talk about the games. The Washington Post has a lot. They have consumer advice. They have product advice, which, by the way, the Times does also. Like, you know,
Wirecutter. Wirecutter is one of the great sections in the New York Times. And the other thing the Times has, which they've really monetized well, is their cooking section.
Yes.
You have to pay extra for, but people do it because the recipes are fabulous and it's become an enormous moneymaker. So what they've figured out is what, you know, and to talk, you know, this is to use a Steve Jobs construct, right? You figure out what the customer wants and needs even before the customer knows what he or she wants and needs, and then you provide it. And that becomes this wonderful foundation on which to build a business. which is exactly what retailers have to do. You can't,
Mhm.
again, we talk about this all the time on Morning Newsbeat, right? You can't just be a source of product. You have to be a
No.
resource. And the
And you
time,
have to be a solution provider. And that's what the
yeah,
Times does now.
right, right. And I keep coming back to, I was thinking of the same thing that Doug McMillan said in his CES, two things he said in his CES address. One is search isn't about finding data, so search should be about finding solutions. Really, really important. And the other thing is he doesn't use the phrase omnichannel. He uses the phrase adaptive retail. And and basically what the Times has done is adaptive journalism.
It's adaptive
Figured
journalism,
out
absolutely.
while still, I think, being showing enormous allegiance to its core expertise, right, which is all the news that's fit to print. It is defining that differently. And yeah, people are going to have problems with what the editorial department says and op-ed pieces say and stuff like that. But still, I mean, the New York Times is the gold standard for this stuff.
Well,
So,
Kevin, I want to cite one thing you mentioned before, which is Sports Illustrated, which was the gold standard of sports journalism. And then there was an article recently about how the cover of Sports Illustrated, both as an artistic measure, I mean, wonderful photography, and it was incredible for athletes to get the cover. And they did not evolve. And if we're not going to talk deep about Sports Illustrated, it got sold to different partners, people who didn't understand what it was.
well, it got sold to marketing companies,
And it's gone.
didn't give a crap about the journalism.
But I think again, folks who are watching this today understand we have to change with the times, because the times you might have been great in the past,
Right.
but you have to be great today and tomorrow. And again, the New York Times and what this book demonstrates is it was from a position of success, and they kept evolving, and they are still evolving, and that's why they're successful.
Yeah. So one last piece I think it's important to talk about, which is that, and that's the notion of leadership.
Mhm.
Because one of the things, and I haven't read the book, but I mean, I've read excerpts from it and stuff like that. You and I have talked a lot about it. But the thing is, during the period of time that Adam Nagourney is writing about, there's a lot of different executive editors at the Times, and the vast majority of them didn't get it, right? And that's part of the problem they had, is they had leadership that didn't understand the notion of adaptive journalism or omni-channel journalism, or whatever you want to call it. That they saw the web, they saw digital versions of the Times as being a threat to the core product. And it was only when the leadership got it with the right people that they were able to kind of do what they needed to do.
Well, and people may not know this, the Times is a family business. The publisher, it is a family, obviously a very wealthy family. What comes across in the book, you're right about the leadership who didn't get it, and it took generational change. But the other thing that came through, and I think folks would get this reading it, is they had some executive editors who were dictatorial, and some who had a reputation for playing favorites. And let's be honest, in management, both of those issues go on. There are dictatorial managers, there are managers who are not even-handed. And you see the impact it's having on the newspaper with people who came in very highly credentialed, but couldn't succeed as executive editor because it's hard to run a large organization. And I think for leaders out there, leadership, just like all the changes with technology, leadership is always evolving. Right now, we have more generations in the workforce than we've ever had. We have all kinds of diversity. What was successful leadership possibly 10 years ago might not succeed today. So again, and Adam and I mean, we were friends 40 years ago. It's been a long time since we worked together. So I am not trying to sell books for Adam. I hope he sells a lot, because I think it's a terrific book. But I think people could read this book and get a lot of lessons in terms of leadership style, in terms of evolving with the times. And let's be clear, the Times in the period that he is looking at, which is about a 30-year period, they made a lot of mistakes. There were a couple of terrible scandals that hit the newspaper, and they have managed to get over them. They confronted the scandals. There was a lot of bloodshed inside the newsroom. But I think it's the kind of book on, it's not about leadership. It's a practical study of leadership at a very, very good company.
Yeah. A friend of mine, a CEO friend of mine likes to talk about how important it is in any organization to create a culture of caring. And when he talks about it, he's often talking about the notion of caring for your employees, right? Your associates, because that's what's going to create a culture of caring for your consumers. But a great CEO, it seems to me, or a great leader, as opposed to a manager, is one that understands that a culture of caring means you care about your customers, you care about your employees, you care about the core expertise of the product, you can, but you care about all the scenario or the context within which you're trying to do business, right? Because you can't ever wall those things off from each other, because they all kind of bleed into each other and affect how successful you're going to be. And I think it was only when the Times, and I think there are retail examples of this, that when companies do that, are able to kind of understand the context and a culture of caring are important, that's when they're going to be successful.
You know, leadership is not easy. And again, this book demonstrates that. Kevin, I know you talk about this all the time. Norman Maine, who's someone we're both huge fans of, he always talks about how your reputation was what you did yesterday. And again, what comes across in this book, the New York Times had a spectacular reputation. They are the most awarded newspaper in the United States. They win Pulitzers like crazy, but they recognize that tomorrow was not theirs by leaning on yesterday. And that is an extremely successful organization that walked away from their success to become a more successful organization in the future. And that's why I think it is such a relevant book, even though it has nothing to do with the food industry, nothing to do with retail, but it's all about dealing with change, and managing a very complex organization. And I think folks would get a lot out of the book.
So the subtitle on the book should have been "All the Business Lessons Fit to Print."
You know what? I'll call Adam. I'll make that suggestion.
All right, Michael, I know you're off doing lots of different kinds of business this week. I hope you're having a good time, but thanks for doing this. I think the lessons are invaluable.
Thanks for having me as always, Kevin.
See you next time, everybody.